Hi, Amanda. It's so wonderful to see you again, listen to you, talk to you. I feel like it's been forever since we last spoke. I've been unwell since we last spoke and lost my voice, but I'm hoping that we're going to be able to get through this today without me coughing or stuttering. How are you?
I am doing better now that I have my friend back. It has been a
Oh,
while, and I know our listeners don't recognize this because we do record all of our episodes in advance. So to them, it's just been the usual 2 weeks, but for us, it's been 2 months, and it's been a very long 2 months. Lots of stuff has happened in both of our lives.
exactly. But it is good to be back on the airwaves. It's great to be able to talk to people about trauma responses and how we can grow from trauma we've experienced. And today we're going to focus on emotional sensitivity.
Yes, last week was all about emotional avoidance, but
Mm,
even though they sound like similar things, they are so completely different.
yeah, yeah.
So we've
So,
had
yeah,
lots of weeks to be able to research all of this. I'm sure you have lots of notes. Can you give us kind of an idea of what emotional sensitivity as a trauma reaction is?
well, let's just start off with what emotional sensitivity is first up so we understand what it is. And we probably need to go right back to what happens with our feelings and how that comes through our body. So, when we experience a feeling, it flows through our bodies. Basically, our body changes. So our heart rate changes, it goes up or down, or our blood pressure changes again, up or down. Um, our muscles tighten or relax. And so essentially, our behaviors are our responses to what's going on internally with us. And it's our capacity to either um, recognize and respond to that or incapacity to recognize and respond to that because our perception is influenced by what happens in our body. Does that make sense?
It does. It does. Very nicely done.
It's emotional sensitivity sort of is our capacity to actually recognize and respond to what's actually happening in our bodies and in others, and being aware of that, being able to respond to that based on what we understand is that emotional response. So if we've got too little emotional sensitivity, we miss whole aspects of the world, both in our internal and external world. If there's too much sensitivity, there's complete dysregulation. We can have mood swings, we can have emotional storms, and we can't actually regulate our own behaviors. And that's where trauma comes in, is that if we have experienced extreme traumas, or it doesn't even have to be extreme traumas, it's just trauma that has impacted on us in such a way that our emotional responses um, either lead to lack of response or too much response. And then we go flying into things like the fight flight mode and things that we've talked about before.
Right.
How's that for a summary?
I think that's perfect. I mean, a lot of this is stuff that I've actually been experiencing in the last couple of weeks myself. I won't go into too many details. You privately know some of what's going on, but we had a bit of an upheaval here in our household, and the the threat of the change of lifestyle
Mm,
was enough to throw me into a little bit of an overly sensitive emotional state.
mm,
Found myself being emotionally sensitive to basically anything and everything. Everything would annoy me. I felt like I was sitting on the edge of my seat at all times. And it was because it had triggered this sense of panic in me.
yeah.
And it left me sitting right there on the edge, and I was overly sensitive to the point where if somebody did or said something that I didn't want to hear right that moment, I would let them know I didn't want to hear that right now. And I wasn't always 100% nice about it.
Yeah. Yep. I can totally relate with that. I've been there myself many a time,
Yeah.
many a time. And, we talk about being emotionally mature. And if you've experienced trauma and it's stayed with you, it's not something that you've been able to process. Those sorts of responses that you just described are our go-to. It's just the way we actually respond to things because it's too much for our system, emotionally, psychologically, physically, to actually deal with.
Right. Right. Yeah. And there's so much of all of this trauma stuff that we don't know how to deal with yet. That's because, think about it, if you've gone through this trauma, in most cases, it is a trauma that you've never experienced before. Of course, you're not going to know how to deal with it.
Yeah.
You know, it's like being in a car accident for the first time and not having somebody there to guide you through what it is that the other driver needs, your car insurance, your license, your registration, all this information. You're going to be completely overwhelmed with the emotions of the moment. And even if you have previously been told these are the items that you're going to need to get through this moment, in the moment, you are not going to remember this.
That's right. That's right.
And emotional sensitivity is, you know, it's often framed as being a negative personality trait. So in my case, I grew up being very sensitive to the point where it didn't take a whole lot to make me cry. And I was told to toughen up. I was told, buck up, buttercup. I was told, stop whining. I grew up hearing all of this stuff. And I kept on asking myself constantly, why am I so sensitive? Why do I feel like this? Why am I so easy to cry? Why do I have to feel these things at all? Because obviously nobody else in my family felt them if they were telling me to not feel this way. But it's really important to understand, even if you have been told this your whole life, that it is just a personality trait. It is not a negative personality trait. It is not a positive personality trait. It is a personality trait, period. It is not a disorder. It's if you equate it to being quiet or thoughtful, you can be quiet, and that's not a bad thing. That's not a good thing. It's just a thing. It exists in your life. It is part of you. But some people develop this because of trauma.
Exactly. And what you're being taught in that family dynamic is to actually suppress your feelings. And by suppressing your feelings, you're actually, they're building up inside you anyway. So they will come out as emotional dysregulation or crying or whatever. And as human beings, we have emotional responses and they have a reason for being there. They are a self-protective measure. And we feel grief, we feel sadness, we feel pain, we feel anger, we feel happiness, we feel excitement. And we're taught in our society, particularly Western developed nations, that we can't express those emotions. You know, if you're in the street and you're singing or dancing, well, you're a bit crazy. But, you know, like I have sung in the streets to myself, and I can tell you I'm not crazy. Maybe I think I'm just not crazy. But do you know what I mean? It's sort of like everybody has this perception of what is normal. And in fact, normal doesn't exist. There's a range of behaviors that are there, and it's just our judgment and our way of creating these norms in society of what's acceptable and unacceptable.
Right.
I think, sorry, yes, go ahead.
We do have to be somewhat careful when it comes to trauma emotional sensitivity, though. I mean, in most cases, emotional sensitivity is just something that exists within us, and it's to varying degrees. But when your brain is hijacked by emotional trauma, it can lead to cognitive issues like the inability to pay attention to certain things. So when the average person, let's say, my husband gets cut off in traffic, he's going to feel frustrated or mad for like a short time, like 30 seconds or so, and then he's going to go back to thinking about what it was he was thinking about before he got cut off. But somebody with a high emotional sensitivity because of trauma might go from feeling calm to feeling rage in a matter of seconds. I know we've talked about this before. And they react by cursing, by flipping the person off, by speeding up to pass them, by then cutting them off. And they might feed on this. They might ruminate about this specific event for hours afterward, not just a matter of 30 seconds. And this can actually contribute to not being able to pay attention in school, to assignments, to teachers, to friends, and can be confused with attention deficit disorder, ADD. So an emotional trauma can lead into people believing that there are other cognitive issues wrong with them.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, I totally agree. I am close with somebody who has experienced a lot of trauma in her life, and there was a situation where she was being diagnosed with borderline personality disorder. Then she was being diagnosed with complex PTSD. Then she was being diagnosed with generalized anxiety disorder. Then she was being diagnosed with something else. And it turns out she is autistic.
Huh. So, wow. So her brain just functions differently than other people's brains.
Yes. But like the behaviors are so similar that, and the dysregulation of emotion is so similar that it's hard to diagnose. And I think it's a lot of people with trauma have been diagnosed incorrectly with various other things, particularly personality disorders, when there's other things at the basis that have not been dealt with, that haven't been processed.
Yeah.
So it's a fine line. It's a fine line.
And back to the ADD thing, I learned only recently from an expert in the field that the majority of people, children who were diagnosed as having ADD or ADHD back in the 1980s, like when my brother and I were people who had experienced severe emotional, sexual, or physical traumas very early in life. Something like 95% of these diagnosed cases. So these kids were being, like my brother and myself, they were being put on Ritalin to control the symptoms of abuse, not the actual issues themselves. So it's really important that people begin to see this for what it is. ADHD is not the medical crisis. Behavioral personalities, depression, these are not the medical crisis that they're being made out to be. Trauma is. This is the underlying factor in so many of these issues. And that's not to say that depression and ADHD and other things like this don't exist outside of trauma. They absolutely do. But the majority of cases are with people who have experienced severe traumas.
Yeah.
And they haven't started to dig deep enough yet to deal with their own traumas, to figure out how to move beyond this.
So that probably sort of segues quite nicely into what are some of the long-term impacts of, emotional sensitivity that's related to trauma. And so one of the things then we can talk about is, well, we have just talked about, is that it can often be misdiagnosed.
Yes, in a very, very big way. And it's just heartbreaking when it does. You have these people that for the rest of their lives believe that there's something wrong with them and they're going to be on medications for it, when really the reality is, with proper treatment of the trauma issues themselves, these are things that we can learn to heal from and move on from.
Yes, definitely. So then let's talk a little bit more, Amanda, about some of those other long-term impacts, and then move on to how we can overcome.
Well, a big one is self-medication. I mean, and this comes up so often when we're talking about the trauma reactions and stuff. But when you're going through all of this and you think there's something wrong with me, I can't focus, I can't concentrate, I can't do this, I can't do that, I'm depressed, I think I've got borderline personality disorder, I think I'm manic depressive, And really, when all of this is coming from trauma, if you're not getting the proper diagnosis, you're going to start self-medicating. And by self-medicating, I'm talking about drugs and alcohol and addictive habits like gambling and pornography addictions, and just these really deep, dark holes where you're looking for a way to be able to fix what everybody else thinks is wrong with you.
Yeah. Yeah. And can I just add, when you mention drugs, it's not just illicit drugs, it's over-the-counter drugs.
Right.
Yeah.
Like Ritalin and Adderall for people that are told that they have ADD because they're survivors of trauma. Then they're
Yeah.
myself. Yeah.
Yeah.
You can also really push people away from you. It's really difficult to form and maintain any kind of an actual relationship with somebody, whether it's a friendship or a relationship with a romantic partner or even a frenemy. It's really difficult to maintain anything when you can't regulate your own emotions.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
how do you navigate life when you're just a passenger on somebody else's bus?
Wow, I love that metaphor. Yeah, absolutely. And we need to be the drivers of our own bus.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. We have to figure out how to take control one more time. And that can be really scary. And it's not like we're saying that you have to move an entire mountain over an ocean in a single move. You know, they say, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. How do you move a mountain? One pebble at a time, one step at a time. You
Mm.
don't have to do it all at once. And somebody told me the other day that it feels like fighting for a particular cause. In this conversation, it was human trafficking. Fighting
Mm.
against human trafficking felt like one person pushing an enormous boulder up the mountain. And he asked me, he said, how do we make that easier? How do we not feel like we've got the weight of the world on our shoulders and trying to push this boulder up the mountain? And I said, with more hands on the boulder.
Yeah.
You have to get the help you need.
Yeah. Yeah. You certainly do. You can't do this alone. And in the book that I've written around narcissistic abuse, I've actually talked about reaching out being one of the key factors in overcoming things like narcissistic abuse, which is a trauma experience. And it's the same with any other trauma experience. You have to reach out. You can't do it alone. And it's usually getting support from professional people, whether it's a trauma counselor or a psychologist or a psychotherapist, um, and finding things that work for you, because a lot of the work that I've done personally to overcome my trauma is through body work. And Gabor Mate, that we've talked about before. He's such an amazing trauma expert from Canada. He very much talks about working through our bodies, embodying positive things, because trauma is basically an embodiment of those negative experiences. It's, we hold it in our bodies. If we're constantly, our heart rates are going up, our blood pressure's going up and down, our muscles are tightening and relaxing, or tightening and tightening and tightening, we're holding that trauma in our bodies. So we have to find ways physically to deal with that. And one of the ways that I first approached it was through yoga and meditation. Other people do exercise. I know a guy who goes to the gym every day, 2 or 3 hours in the gym, just pumping it out, pumping it out, pumping it out. But that's his way of dealing with it. And his emotional state is much more regulated now that he's able to just express that in a physical way. Now, I'm not saying go to the gym and pump it out for 3 hours. That's not necessarily the healthiest way to go. But each of us have to find our own way that works for us.
Right. Right. And if we don't, I mean, one of the major long-term effects is that if you go through trauma does not automatically mean that you have PTSD. It does not ever mean that. But if it's untreated trauma, it can and often does develop into PTSD,
Yeah.
depression, anxiety, all kinds of other issues,
Yeah.
including like self-harm. So
Yeah.
yeah, it's really important to find those outlets to be able to work with somebody and to have some way to focus on it to try and heal from the trauma. And
Mm.
it's not easy. This is
It
hard
isn't.
work.
It is. It is. Like as we said earlier in the recording, I've been quite unwell for the last couple of months and I haven't been doing my exercise. And I've noticed, particularly in this last week, that I've been improving in my health. When I'm in bed at night, my whole body is
Yeah.
really tense, and I'm conscious of it and I relax. And then if I haven't fallen asleep, but I'm still awake, I realize, oh my gosh, my body's tensed
You're
up
doing
again.
it again.
So, then I use other little strategies of breathing deeply to um, relax my body. And so then I fall asleep again. But yeah, and I think this goes back to what we said just a moment ago, is that it's an ongoing process. It doesn't just go away. And it's important to use the strategies and the tools that work for us in an ongoing way. Um, because that trauma will always be there, regardless of how much you try to deal with it. It's still in the recesses of your mind. Something at some point will trigger something, but ultimately it's about how we manage ourselves on a daily basis and how well we can manage our daily lives after experiencing that trauma.
Yeah, and in some of our earliest episodes, we were talking about different things like the breathing techniques and the five senses techniques. And when you're in the moment of trying to figure out how to deal with this, those things are still going to be very, very handy. So if you remember the five senses, it's the first one is what are five things that you can see, four things that you can feel, three things that you can hear, two things that you can smell, and one thing that you can taste. And you take your
Mm,
time and you go through these things. And if you need to, you write them down and keep it on a slip of paper in your wallet. And when you start going through a panic attack or something where you feel this need, this overwhelming need for self harm or self medication, focus instead on self regulation. And that's what
mm,
this is going to do. It's going to help
mm,
reground you, remind you that you are away from whatever the trauma is. You're safe. You are going to be okay. And practice the deep breathing technique too. Hugely helpful in the moment.
yeah.
And we've talked about it before, but other things would be art
Yes.
therapy, writing therapy, journaling, all of these creative outlets. I talked to a lady earlier today whose outlet is opera singing.
Oh, wow. How amazing.
Yeah, and she said with the versatility of singing in any genre, really, you're able to take whatever is bottled up inside of you and you can either scream it out or you can whisper it like an angel.
Yeah. Yeah. Actually, singing is amazing. Singing is amazing. That's one thing I have done in the past is join choirs
Yeah.
and just being with other people, standing in a room full of people who are singing with you. Um, it's a whole body experience, and you can only feel joy at the end of it. And so, yeah, I highly recommend singing as a therapy.
I think it's amazing. I think there's not enough people who understand the therapy that's involved with doing something like that, not just because it's a creative outlet, but because it is a verbal outlet. It's an
Mm,
expressive outlet. You can move to go with your singing, whether you're
yeah,
dancing or just using your hands to talk, because I do this all the time. um, there's so much of all of the other creative outlets that are involved with singing. It's an all over full body experience.
completely, completely.
There
But
should
even
be
things
more
like,
music therapists that focus on singing, honestly.
look, I agree with you wholeheartedly. But going back to that creativity, one of the things that I've done in my research is come across this theme over and over and over again, that having that creative outlet is actually a very positive way of working with trauma and overcoming it. Um,
Yeah.
so, I know I'm contradicting myself slightly here in saying that, it always lives with you because it's part of your experience. But in terms of overcoming, what I mean is that um, on a day-to-day basis, you're able to focus on your life, not constantly thinking about the trauma experience.
Right. And even if you're not constantly thinking about it, it can still, if you're not careful, it can still rule your day-to-day decisions and your
Yes.
reactions, and it
Yes.
is all consuming.
Yeah.
And you have to stop it from being all consuming if you expect to be able to do anything at all with your life, to move
Yeah.
forward, to walk away from that into a healthier lifestyle.
Yeah. 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 And it's interesting because one of the things that I, in my personal experience, have come across with emotional sensitivities, people with trauma have a particular way of seeing the world, and or you can have a particular way of seeing the world. And some people see the world very negatively, and anything that anyone would do in that interaction with them is automatically experienced in a negative way. And it might not be that the other person is being negative at all. It's just the way that we've interpreted it as a trauma survivor. Um, like I recently had a situation where a friend of mine basically said, I don't want to be your friend anymore because she kept interpreting my behavior as something that was directed at her rather than me dealing with my trauma. And, even when I said, well, this is what's happening, it was shut down because they took things personally. So going back to what we were saying earlier about impacting relationships, our perceptions when we've experienced trauma impact on our understanding of the world, and that's that emotional sensitivity of the world around us
Right.
really impacts on those decisions, as you were saying a moment ago. um, what we choose to do, how we choose to go about it, and um, it can wind up being a very lonely place.
Oh, absolutely. And another part of this is 2 episodes from now, we're going to be talking about something called hypervigilance, which kind of falls under the category of emotional sensitivity. When we start
Yes, it
getting
does.
into it, we'll talk a lot more about it. But this hypervigilance, you are, let's say, I walk into a room where there's 50 people. If I have not existed in the world of trauma, I'm going to see this as, oh, yay, especially if I'm an extrovert. Oh, yay, this is a great party. I'm excited to be here. As a survivor of trauma, you walk into a room of 50 people, and your first reaction is, who's the most dangerous person here? What can I do to appease them?
Mm.
People think this is empathy or being an empath, and they're confusing the two.
Yeah. Yeah.
Hypervigilance is something else entirely. And I'm looking forward to that episode 2 weeks, not 2 weeks from now, 4 weeks from now. Next week, we're actually going to be diving into eating disorders.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, that one's going to get a little ugly. Because of a lot of the upheaval that we've had here in our household recently, I have redeveloped a somewhat unhealthy relationship with food, to the point where food rationing is a very real thing for me. And I'm not giving myself enough food to sustain. And I'm having to go back and remind myself, I'm not going to starve. I'm okay. It's time to eat.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a bit scary. Yeah.
Yep. Yep.
All righty. Well, I think on that very um, challenging note, let's wind up today, and we will talk again in a couple of weeks' time about eating disorders, and wishing everybody well who's been listening to us.
And thank you for listening, you guys. And hey, reach out to us and let us know what you think about the episodes. Share this with a friend, especially anybody that you could think of that might get any kind of value out of this. We would love to interact with you guys. So find us on Facebook and just let us know how you found it and how you like the show and what you think that we could do to change it up or have more fun with it, whatever. Talk to us.
Ciao for now.